April 1945. Bavaria. The war was collapsing, but inside the barbed perimeter of a former labor camp, silence ruled. Dozens of women stood in uneven rows as American trucks rolled through the gates. The stars and stripes fluttered against the gray sky, a sight that felt unreal after years of confinement. When the guards had fled days earlier, the prisoners expected the usual chaos. Interrogations, ration lines, orders shouted in foreign tongues. Instead, the American officer who stepped forward did something none of them expected. He reached into his pocket, produced a handful of notebooks and pencils, and placed them on a wooden table. "You may keep them," his translator said simply. The women stared in disbelief. Some trembled. For years, writing had been forbidden, a punishable act of defiance. Now, suddenly, they were allowed to remember, to put down the faces, the hunger, the dead. The sound of a pencil touching paper that morning was the quietest and most defiant sound of liberation. Because sometimes the war ended not with gunfire, but with words. By the spring of 1945, Allied forces were pushing deep into Germany. The Reich was crumbling, its armies scattered, its cities burned to ash. Yet behind the front lines, across occupied territories and hidden valleys, were countless camps, some vast industrial complexes, others improvised prisons. Among these were facilities holding women from every corner of Europe. Nurses, students, factory workers, even wives of resistance members. They had been forced into labor for the war machine, stitching uniforms, producing munitions, digging trenches. Some were Jewish survivors of camps evacuated westward as the Soviets advanced. Others were political detainees or foreign civilians caught in the tides of conquest. When the Americans of the 45th Infantry Division, the Thunderbirds, reached these sites, they found conditions beyond anything described in military briefings. Emaciated prisoners, the stench of disease, makeshift graves. In some camps, guards had fled. In others, SS men were still shooting the weak before surrendering. Liberation for the women was not an explosion of joy. It was confusion, disbelief, and sudden exposure to freedom they no longer knew how to use. They had no documents, no families, no nations to return to. Many could not even recall the last time they spoke without fear. American units, initially trained for combat, were now tasked with something different: administering humanity. Field medics became caretakers. Intelligence officers became record keepers. The U.S. Army's psychological warfare and civil affairs branches issued strict orders. Survivors must be fed, registered, debriefed, and documented. Among the paperwork of liberation, rosters, affidavits, interrogation forms, lay one unplanned detail: the small notebooks handed out by junior officers and medics. They were not official issue, yet soon appeared everywhere. The act was simple, but it gave back a voice to those who had been silenced for years. Inside the camps, before the arrival of the Americans, silence was a weapon. Writing, even a single note, could mean torture or execution. Prisoners learned to memorize instead. Faces, names, the numbers tattooed beside them. Words survived only in whispers or carved discreetly on wooden bunks. Women, especially, guarded their thoughts in secret. Some scratched initials into soap bars that would soon dissolve. Others composed entire letters in their heads, reciting them like prayers before sleep. Paper was rarer than bread. A scrap of wrapping from a Red Cross parcel was a treasure. A pencil stub? Contraband. The Nazi system feared documentation. It thrived on erasing identity, reducing people to labor units, not lives. In Ravensbrück, Helmbrechts, and Buchenwald's subcamps, female prisoners were forbidden to write, sing, or even keep private belongings. The absence of words was deliberate. Memory itself was a threat. When the front collapsed and Allied artillery grew nearer, thousands of women were forced on death marches westward. Diaries, if hidden, were often buried under snow or burned to avoid discovery. Yet fragments survived, concealed inside clothing seams, beneath floorboards, even inside hollowed-out soap cases. By the time the Americans reached Bavaria, these women had been stripped of everything but memory. To suddenly be allowed to write again, openly, without punishment, felt unreal. Some approached the U.S. soldiers hesitantly, unsure if this was another trick. Others wept at the sight of paper. The Americans, untrained in trauma care, often misunderstood what that simple act meant. For them, it was a gesture of mercy, a way to occupy restless survivors while camps were processed. For the women, it was rebirth. Each sentence was an act of reclaiming the self, proof that they still existed, that their suffering had witnesses. It was here, amid broken fences and field hospitals, that the first words of remembrance began to return to Europe. Among the survivors was a 23-year-old Polish woman named Zofia Kowalczyk, liberated from a subcamp near Dachau. Her hands shook as she wrote. The diary she was given by an American nurse began with only 3 words: "I am alive." For months afterward, she filled its pages with names, women she remembered from the transports, those who hadn't survived, and those who were still missing. Each entry was short, clipped, almost mechanical. Yet behind every name was the echo of a voice, a moment reclaimed from oblivion. Zofia's diary, preserved by her children decades later, would become one of the earliest first-hand civilian accounts used by post-war historians studying female forced labor. The second angle is administrative. Why did American forces allow this? By late 1944, the Allied command had realized that testimony was vital to documenting crimes. The U.S. Army's Civil Affairs Division and the Psychological Warfare Branch issued guidelines encouraging interviews with liberated civilians. Written statements, especially diaries, were viewed as authentic evidence, not propaganda. Field officers were told, "Encourage survivors to record while memory is fresh." Many units lacked official forms, so soldiers improvised. Some donated their own notebooks. Others requisitioned paper from nearby towns or captured German stores. Medics distributed pencils along with medical tags. The same supply trucks that carried bandages and K-rations now carried stationery, unintentionally arming survivors with words instead of weapons. For the Americans, it was both humanitarian and pragmatic. Diaries could provide intelligence, names of guards, camp layouts, or burial sites. But for the women who wrote them, the meaning was deeper. Writing became a form of control, a way to order chaos. In a world where the enemy had dictated every breath, the page became the only place they could dictate anything, even the act of holding a pencil, of choosing. One word over another was a small victory over the machinery that had sought to erase them. In those early weeks of liberation, the camp notebooks multiplied, each one a fragile monument built out of paper and memory. And soon, the American policy that began as practicality would transform into something far more human: the preservation of truth itself. The simple materials, a stub of graphite, a cheap soldier's notebook, army-issue paper, became the foundation of historical memory. These weren't elegant leather-bound journals. They were ration pads, medical forms, or blank pages torn from field manuals. Yet those fragile sheets would outlast empires. Archival specialists later discovered that the U.S. Army's use of high-cellulose pulp paper, common in wartime supply chains, inadvertently preserved ink better than most European paper stock. Many of those diaries written in haste and fear remain legible 8 decades later. Their survival is a miracle of chemistry as much as courage. Some were translated by Army linguists and stored in the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, archives. Others were handed to UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration for Refugee Documentation. Within months, fragments of handwriting from anonymous women in Bavaria reached Washington, London, and Nuremberg. The fourth angle is leadership and moral decision. Among the officers who encouraged such writing was Captain Robert H. Jackson, a lawyer turned intelligence officer, not to be confused with the Nuremberg prosecutor of the same name. Stationed near Landsberg, Jackson believed written testimony would force the world to look. He authorized distribution of writing materials to every recovered camp under his jurisdiction, a quiet defiance of standard military austerity. His men recorded the difference it made. Women who had refused food began to eat again. Those who could not speak began to write. The camp infirmaries, once filled with moans, now murmured with the sound of pages turning. For Jackson and others, it became clear. Liberation was not just about opening gates. It was about restoring voice. And sometimes, voice came before healing. These American officers had stumbled upon a profound truth, that history survives only when someone is allowed to hold a pencil. The diaries became both evidence and salvation. They captured details the victors would have otherwise missed. The smell of burning straw, the whispers of names, the moments between the last shot and the first breath of freedom. Soon, those words would travel far beyond the camps, into courtrooms, archives, and classrooms, becoming the first sentences of justice. And that is where the story turns from survival to testimony. The turning point came in May 1945, just days after Germany's unconditional surrender. In the small Bavarian town of Landsberg am Lech, a former satellite of the Dachau system, U.S. troops uncovered a collection of diaries, dozens of them, written by liberated women in shaky handwriting. They were gathered by Captain Jackson's men and taken to a field headquarters for translation. Among the notebooks was one that stood out, its pages spotted with blood, the cover made from a torn cement sack. Inside were 3 languages: Polish, German, and French. The writer, later identified as Marta Weiss, a Jewish nurse from Krakow, had recorded not only names and dates but entire paragraphs describing the transport routes, guard identities, and coded markings on freight cars. For American interrogators, this was invaluable. Her diary mapped the structure of the Nazi forced labor network, something no official record fully explained. The evidence she unknowingly preserved reshaped the Allied understanding of how female labor was distributed across munitions plants, textile factories, and airfield construction units. But what shook the translators most was not the data. It was the humanity. In one entry, Marta had written, "If I die, and these words live, then I am not lost. Someone will know we tried to stay human." When General Lucius D. Clay, then Deputy Military Governor for Germany, was briefed on the diaries, he ordered that similar documents from all liberated camps be collected, archived, and preserved for potential war crime. Proceedings? It was one of the first official recognitions of civilian testimony as legal evidence in modern warfare. In that single decision, born from a woman's trembling handwriting, history pivoted. The American military had transformed private pain into public record, ensuring that silence would no longer protect the guilty. For the women who had written in fear, their words now carried the weight of justice. And as more diaries surfaced from Dachau, Buchenwald, and Bergen-Belsen, the fragile notebooks began to speak louder than any weapon. They had turned memory into proof, and grief into power. The discovery at Landsberg was only the beginning. Within weeks, hundreds of female written diaries surfaced across southern Germany. The U.S. Army's war crimes investigation teams collected them in crates marked personal effects evidence. Each one told a different story, yet together they formed a mosaic of truth the Nazis had tried to erase. When the first Nuremberg preparatory hearings began in late 1945, several of these diaries were quietly referenced in intelligence briefings. Though most remained unpublished, they provided investigators with eyewitness descriptions, identifying specific SS officers, convoy routes, and camp commandants. In one particularly chilling case, the diary of a French teacher from Lyon led to the arrest of an SS transport officer hiding under a false name in Munich. Her careful notes, dates, train numbers, and a sketch of his distinctive scar were enough to confirm his identity. But beyond the courtrooms, the emotional power of those diaries spread among the troops who found them. Soldiers who had stormed bunkers now read quiet pages filled with longing, loss, and love. Many admitted later that the words changed how they saw the war. It was no longer only a campaign of maps and strategies. It was a war against the annihilation of the human voice. Army chaplains began reading excerpts during field services. War correspondents wrote features about the notebooks of freedom. One U.S. officer wrote home, saying, "They are the smallest books I've ever seen, yet they hold the largest truths for the women." The act of writing transformed from survival to justice. American medical units helped photograph and microfilm dozens of diaries before distributing them back to their owners. Some women kept them hidden again, this time not from fear, but from the world's noise, wanting to protect what was finally theirs. What had begun as a spontaneous act of kindness, the handing over of blank notebooks, had become a turning point in how wars would be remembered. From those thin pages, a new kind of weapon emerged, truth, written by trembling hands that refused to forget. And in the quiet aftermath, the question lingered, what would become of these voices once the world moved on? In the months after liberation, the camps emptied. Survivors were transferred to displaced persons centers, former German barracks now filled with life again. Children crying, typewriters clacking, medical stations humming. Among the few possessions each woman carried was her diary. It was her proof of existence, her passport back into humanity. The Americans, overwhelmed by the scale of recovery, began shipping many notebooks to archival units for translation and safekeeping. Some ended up in the U.S. National Archives, others with the United Nations War Crimes Commission. Yet countless remained in private hands, hidden in drawers, suitcases, and family attics for decades. A few became famous. Zofia Kowalczyk's diary was published in Poland in 1961. Marta Weiss's fragments were used as corroboration in the Augsburg trials against former SS transport officers. Others were never seen again, lost to time or to the silence their authors returned to after the war. But their collective meaning outlived them all. Those diaries, born in darkness, reshaped how the world documented atrocity. They inspired the creation of early oral history projects, survivor testimony programs, and post-war psychological rehabilitation models. Later conflicts, from Korea to Bosnia, would draw on this precedent, that letting the survivors write, in their own words, was not indulgence, but necessity. Even historians today describe those American notebooks as the first free words of post-war Europe. They captured not the politics of victory, but the fragile moment when freedom returned in the form of memory. For the women who wrote them, it was not about vengeance or evidence. It was about existence. Each word declared, "I was here." The irony is stark. The world's most powerful army, armed with tanks and bombers, dealt its most profound blow against tyranny not through weapons, but through stationery. A pencil and a blank page restored what occupation had stolen: dignity. In the end, those small diaries became the bridge between horror and history. They turned anonymous numbers back into names, and silence back into testimony. Many of those pages still rest in archives, brittle, fading, yet alive. When you read them today, you can still feel the urgency in every line. The the quiet triumph of a hand refusing to tremble. And if you listen closely, between the scratches of the pencil, you can almost hear the whisper that began it all. You may keep them, because sometimes the most powerful act of liberation is simply letting the world remember itself.